Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. This is Mike Stecklein, partner with the Institute for Enterprise Excellence. Um, I was just chatting with my friend Dan Robertson. He dialed in earlier on the webinar and was sharing with him that as things have evolved with the situation with the coronavirus situation, I pondered whether I should continue on with this webinar as scheduled, and I thought that I would go ahead and do that. Just thinking that perhaps people would benefit from some semblance of some normality, and I know that a lot of people will listen to the recording of this webinar, perhaps if they can't participate directly at the time that it's being delivered. So I'm going to go ahead and do it. This is a topic that's a continuation of a number of conversations started in July of last year. I did a webinar and then one in August of last year, 2018. So in 2018, did 2 webinars on this topic, and then this is a continuing part of that conversation. And just to offer some thoughts before we get into this, a chance for people to check in and talk about how they're doing. If anybody wants to stay on after the webinar, and I will shut the recording off, but if anybody wants to chat a bit or just share a little bit about what they're doing or what they're doing to cope with the situation, I'm happy to do that. Put a bit.ly link on this slide to share a link to a podcast that I found very helpful, a podcast called The Happiness Lab, hosted by Dr. Laurie Santos at Yale University, and I found it to be very beneficial. So if it helps you, that's great. There's a little housekeeping here. It says that the phones are muted. I decided I'm not going to follow that. I'm going to keep it unmuted. If you want to silence your phones on your end, you can. At any time people want to ask a question or make a comment, I will pause occasionally just to offer that as an option for people to participate. You can also put any thoughts or comments in the chat function. And this is being recorded, and it will be available for you and others as we proceed. So here's some things that I've shared previously in the work that we do at IEX, and it's a familiar model for many people, perhaps, thinking about people attempting to achieve results, and they learn some tools and use some tools. Tools and methods will work, they do work, and people find benefit from that. It isn't uncommon for them to try to spread that into other areas, and we'll be talking about the limitations of spreading and the scoping the tools and other quote solutions. But it isn't uncommon for there to be pushback and not see that these things are widely accepted. And then we see this phenomenon of a series of attempts over time, people learning and adopting and then giving up on different things. And then you see this pattern continue to go time after time after time. And as people reflect on their careers and the work that they've had, they can identify these things. It goes by a number of names, a flavor of the month. Dr. Deming called it the hope for instant pudding. We called it the comfort of the comfort zone, where people just get comfortable waiting for that next thing that they know is going to be around the corner and just see what that one's like. It's been called where tools lead, fools follow, a quote from a Shingo recipient from a number of years ago, and a quote that I like from Dave Snowden, whose materials, one of the purposes of this webinar is to point people in the direction of Dave Snowden and the work that he has done. And he talks about it's the latest new wonderful thing we should all follow. And these patterns that show up, these humps on this pathway, come by many names. It could be total quality management, could be continuous quality improvement, could be Six Sigma. They go by different names. Could be lean, could be many. One that I think probably deserves to go in this pattern is the popular form of design thinking. Has become something that is a commodity that perhaps is also one of these hope for instant pudding sort of a solutions that isn't really going to be beneficial. So I want to talk a little bit about models and frameworks. And what I would like to do is talk a little bit about the difference between a model and a framework and what that means. Models help us to, it helps to represent reality of a situation. One thing I learned from Dave Snowden, and you can find this on his blog post here, and I put a link to a bit.ly link to the blog post here. It's just something that he's done in teaching a group of people, takes a toy elephant out and puts it on the table and says, "What is that?" And people will say, "Well, that's an elephant." I said, "Okay, so what does an elephant do?" And people provide the different answers. You know, you can use it for transportation, it can move logs, it does tricks and all that stuff. So does this elephant do those things? And of course, they say no. So it's a metaphor for an element. It's a model, and this is something that might be helpful for people to get a grasp on that. So it's not reality itself. It's meant to um, represent reality, distinct from a framework, which is a way of looking at reality and looking at various perspectives. And the reason I want to make this distinction is one of the topics I want to point out today is the Cynefin sense-making framework and how it is a way to look at reality with different perspectives. I also think about the quote from George Box, statistician from my alma mater, University of Wisconsin in Madison, and his quote, "All models are wrong, but some models are useful." He was talking about mathematical models, but I think it fits here as well. And in discussions when I had him as a professor, I would agree with that. He would say that too. They're representing something, but there's some worlds where those models are not going to be useful. I also like the depiction from Derek and Laura Cabrera from their book Systems Thinking Made Simple, and the reality that when we interact with the world, we're really interacting through our mental models, and we update those based upon our experiences. But we have to remember that the mental models that we have are not the ones that other people have, and they're all going to be different. So just some distinctions and terminology there to distinguish the differences. So going back to our model, one of the things we try to point out is that what people may be missing, if all that they're looking at is the relationship between results, tools, and systems, and trying to push those forward, it really is the problem of the program pathway. And we encourage people to think about an entirely different pathway that takes them in a different direction and also brings in some other aspects of what we call our sustainability model. And it starts that direction includes a discussion about a connection to the overall purpose. What is it we're trying to achieve? What is the ultimate goal? Both personal purpose and organizational purpose. And then the learning about some different guiding principles of enterprise excellence that can help us to understand better behaviors that we would have if we understood those principles. Then we can think about design of better systems, and then we'll pull the tools that we need or invent the tools that we need. And that will in turn have an impact on those results that we're trying to achieve, but also reinforce those behaviors that we're trying to exhibit as well. So that's the sustainability model that we talk about. We also put this together. It's the velocity model, and it shows domains of principles, principle of align, principles of enable, and principles of improve. People familiar with the work that we do are familiar with these. For the purposes of this webinar, my intent is to focus in on 3 of them. And in this domain, I want to talk about embracing science. In this domain, I want to make some distinctions between complexity thinking and how it is not the same as the popular term systems thinking. And then with the enable domain, I want to go back to the original definition of, as this was being developed in companies like Toyota, the principle of respect humanity and understand the way human beings really work, how human beings make decisions, and pull that in. So I'm going to hit upon these 3 as we go through this discussion. I want to continue this with a framework, a model. It's a 2x2 matrix that Dave Snowden has put together. The bit.ly link on the lower left-hand corner takes you to a document that unpacks this in a little bit more detail. And again, my whole purpose behind this is to surface this knowledge that Dave and his group has put together and point people in the direction of that website. And I'll have more information about that. So in this 2x2 matrix, you can see vertical axis, simple inputs, complex outputs, horizontal axis, same thing, simple inputs, complex outputs. And within the 2x2 matrix, we see different categories. Lower left-hand corner, scientific management. To the right of that, what's become known as possible systems thinking, systems dynamics, and I'll have something about that as well. Upper left-hand corner, computational complexity, and how that is different than what you see on the lower parts of the grid. And then the main topic that I want to point people to is what Snowden and others are calling anthrocomplexity. So to unpack this a little bit, just talk about some terms and some resources that might be familiar with. Thinking of scientific management, people might think about Frederick Taylor and the writings, his writings, and talking about design of systems, specificity of work. I think in terms of Dr. Deming, particularly his book, Out of the Crisis, the version that I have was published in 1986. The 1982 version of the same book was originally the topic of his 4-day seminars, Quality, Productivity, and Competitive Position. And then also other thought leaders. You can think about the work of cybernetics and others, but basically simple inputs, simple outputs. Thinking about physical augmentation. What are you trying to do to make things work? Going into this realm, I can remember when this book was very popular. A lot of good information in this book, but it really unpacked a lot of things that has people can think about systems dynamics and trying to think about business process redesign and really trying to think about the metaphor of the organization as an organism and how do we design better systems, and really strong systems thinking became prominent. I can also recall, and perhaps you can too, books such as authors like Hammer and Campy on re-engineering the corporation. The whole focus on Six Sigma, and I was working at the American Society for Quality at the time when that was very popular and was noticing it becoming real prominent. And of course, people connected lean to Six Sigma, not realizing that in reality, lean was intended to remove waste. And some people would say it removes the waste that Six Sigma built into the process. I can get into controversial comments, but again, it's all in this realm of better improvement through systems thinking and redesign of systems. I want to move to upper left-hand corner and talk about algorithms, simple rules that you see in nature, that when you see, for instance, birds flocking in the air, they're following some simple heuristics to maintain speed and distance and then avoid collision. And you see these patterns of birds flocking through the air. Also studying animals such as termites and ants. And again, studying the idea there are simple rules that when they work together, they don't need an overall leader to accomplish what they're doing, but they're operating according to these heuristics that are being followed. And then, you study what happens with snowflakes, and you see the repetition of patterns. And so this idea of simulation and algorithms has benefit. Most recently, I saw this with explaining the patterns that people are trying to attack the coronavirus, the novel COVID-19. And so that bit.ly links takes you to a great article that includes a video that explains there is benefit to looking at simulations. What it doesn't do, it doesn't predict. It won't predict in actuality what will happen, which gets into the final category of anthrocomplexity, which needs to be understood a lot deeper, and people need to understand that it is a lot different than these other buckets that I've shown thus far. One of the ways to think about this is to think about, with popular systems thinking, the whole approach seems to be, we've got our current state, let's identify a target that is ideally where we want to be. There's this gap that we see, and let's pull ourselves toward this target, always keeping that target in mind. That is different than what can be seen in this approach with looking at complexity and understanding that, certainly understanding your current state as a beginning point and understanding the direction you want to go, knowing that, but not thinking about the outcome targets that you want to hit, but trying to understand that experimentation along the way and looking at and seeing the novelty along the way that unveils itself is really a better way, and a more one that's based in naturalizing science principles, that is going to be much more successful. Now, one of the people that Dave Snowden talks about as far as connecting, there are some similarities between scientific management and these topics of complexity theory. Dave did some co-teaching with Peter Drucker on complexity science, and they did see similarities. They saw that in scientific management, there was an apprentice model for people to learn their jobs. There was definitely inclusion of freedom of decision making, so people weren't hampered and shackled by rigid structures. There was definitely room for human decision making. And in my own personal belief is I think this is where Dr. Deming was headed with his 1993 book and his articulation of the system of profound knowledge and the interaction of those four components of a system: appreciation for a system, psychology, theory of knowledge, and knowledge about variation. I know he was interested in neuroscience. I know he was interested in the connection of these things. At the time, the language of complexity was being formulated, and I think it was his best intent to try to point people in the direction of further study. So it's on my own belief that I think that he was on the pathway to pointing out this sort of difference. Now, there is another 2x2 date matrix that I think is very beneficial to think about this. And again, the bit.ly link on the lower left-hand corner for the source takes you to, I think this one takes you to a video to unpack this, another 2x2 matrix. On the vertical axis, you see being able to predict, being able to explain, and also the horizontal axis, when is it scalable? Things being scalable at low risk or scale at high risk. And so with these four areas within this 2x2 matrix, classic science fits here, the kind of science you learn in school, the kind of science that people continue to learn about, testing hypotheses. Other people repeat those tests, and you can make predictions. And so you can scale the application of those principles, and it works well, and you can predict. Now, contrast that with case-based interpretation. So people studying different cases, examples of improvement efforts, cases of companies that do well. And that fits in the category of it helps for explanation. It does not help with prediction. It can help you to learn what people did, but to say that because it worked for them will work for you is not going to work. In this corner down here, labeled pseudoscience, this is where people purport that they've discovered a simple recipe or some sort of a universal claim about something. And there's no shortage of this in books that you can find in bookstores and on the internet, where people have found that they have the answer. I like the terminology, again, that Dave uses. He talks about this is a magpieism. And if you know about the bird of a magpie, they're very good at collecting shiny objects to adorn their nests, and also they'll feed on the eggs and the chicks of defenseless birds, and causing problems. And so we have to be careful about some of these claims for things that people purport to have universal solutions to every problem, and really pass it through this filter to understand, is it based on good science? And so that gets us into this corner here, looking at the work that Dave and others are pointing to really understand naturalizing sense making and how this makes more sense. And so the purposes of going through these slides is just to illustrate how fundamentally different this area of study really is. So I'm going to pause before I get into the Cynefin framework to see if there's any questions or comments from anybody that's on the phone. Take a drink of water. I'll assume it's all clear for now. Want to get on with the next part of the conversation and talk a little bit about the Cynefin sense-making framework. I've mentioned Dave Snowden. That's a picture of him. He comes from Wales, very proud of the Wales heritage. The word Cynefin is a Welsh word. It doesn't have an English translation that translates well. Probably the best understanding is that it's a place of multiple belongings, but it comes with the Welsh heritage as far as understanding what it really means. I first learned about this. You can get this Harvard Business Review article from 2007, one of the most cited business articles, very popular. Dave and co-author unpack the model very well, and it's a good resource for people to have. This is the website for Cognitive Edge, and a great source of resources that I'd like to point people to and encourage people to study it deeper. This is a link to a video that Dave goes through explaining the Cynefin framework. And as I said before, I've touched on this in 2 previous webinars, and you can go to those links to review what I talked about those times. And what I'm going to do is now unpack it the way I've been talking about it and seeing if it resonates for the people that are on today's webinar. So I think in terms of new rules to understand complexity and when it makes sense to manage in different ways. And rule 1 is to understand that not all systems or situations are the same. And you have a continuum on the right-hand side where there are systems that are more ordered and things are more predictable. And you have on the left-hand side unordered and unpredictable. And then within this, the lower right-hand corner, thinking in terms of situations where it's obvious what's going on, it's obvious what we should all do. Upper right-hand corner, where it's still on the ordered side, but it's complicated and it's going to require some expertise to proceed. Upper left-hand corner, the domain of complexity, also sometimes called complex adaptive systems. So that's why I put that there. And the lower left-hand corner, thinking about the chaos realm and how that is different. And so in the course of the next couple slides, I'm just going to retrace over these 4 parts, but also get into the 5th part, which is in the middle, which I haven't yet talked about yet. So it is not a 2x2 matrix. As I showed before, 2x2 matrices, it's a framework. These aren't 4 quadrants because there are 5 domains. So we'll unpack this a little bit more. In the obvious domain, common example of this is the agreement that we're all going to drive on a certain side of the road. In the United States, it'll be the right-hand side. If you find yourself in another country, it's a different side. But the point is they all agree that's what we should do, and everyone follows it, and things that work out well. Upper right-hand corner, things are complicated. You're going to have to rely on some expertise to understand what's going on. Again, it's still in the ordered side. There is some cause and effect relationship, but it requires some analysis. Complex realm, the image and the story that goes with this is best comes from Dave Snowden talking about how would you manage a children's birthday party. And so if you go to that bit.ly link, you can see a brief recording where Dave tells that story. He does a great job, obviously, and it's his story, and it would be great if everyone learned from that. There is a great blog post on his website where he talks again about managing complexity here and how it's different than the other domains, and he brings in the character Socrates. I think it's actually someone else that sent him this story, but he put it on his blog post. So we'll be getting into that a little bit more, complexity, obviously. And then in the chaotic realm, a common example that people will use is what it was like with after 9/11. And this is where I think that I've talked to people and said, I think that's where we are now with this whole challenge with coronavirus and understanding that situation. So I'll be pondering a little bit on that and interested in your thoughts on that as we ponder this together. So again, just retracing over the domains. So we're back down on the obvious domain. There is a relationship between cause and effect. Cause and effect is clear. When we do this, we'll get that. The complicated domain, there is cause and effect, but it's not evident. We need to do some analysis. We need to figure it out. With complex, the cause and effect is only evident in hindsight. You can see how the dots connected and see how what we did produced the result that we got. And the chaos domain is a temporary state. And this is where the cause and effect is different. So chaos is very hard to maintain. And it is a temporary state. People will take action. We'll get into the right actions to take in each of these domains. People take action. People come up with things they'd like to try, and they try to move their way, and they do move their way out of chaos. But you have to understand that that is different than complexity. Again, tracing back to the lower right-hand corner, the obvious domain, recipes, checklists, procedures. I put standard work in quotations. Again, I was talking to Dan Robertson briefly before we started this webinar. Where does standard work fit? It probably fits on the right-hand side, but it probably also moves back and forth as people find different ways that they would like to do their current best practice, but they have to be careful about putting strong rigidity to that standard work. Examples of the complicated, familiar examples, going to a physician or a provider to try to find out what's going on, law, engineering, many moving parts, the moonshot to move to get people from liftoff to the moon and then back. A lot of moving parts that had to be connected and worked well, which was, people might say it was complex, but it was complicated. It just required a lot of engineering and math and understanding how it was all going to work, but it was complicated. Anytime you're dealing with people, if you've got various hypotheses about what's going on and what we should do, and those hypotheses can't be resolved within the time period you have, you're really dealing with a complex system. Examples of this is, politics. Anytime you've got people, systems, strategy, deciding what to do, what not to do, you're trying to move in, and things are moving around, and you're doing your best to try to make that happen. So that is distinct from complex. And in the chaos domain, when people do, and I'll be getting into this, what leads to the workarounds that lead to failure? What leads to those situations where, say, for instance, in healthcare, there's a wrong site surgery or the wrong drug is given to a patient? And those are drastic examples. But when we over-constrain a system, that's what happens, and we find these examples that land us in this chaotic state, and we have to work our way out. But I'll be getting into that shortly. So that rule number one is not all situations are the same. Not all systems are the same. And when you don't understand this, you're likely to not see the progress you want to make. So rule two is when we understand what we've got, we can then make best decisions based upon that situation. So it's contextual. So again, starting with the obvious lower right-hand corner, we sense, categorize, respond. What what country are we in? It's the United States. Okay, it's in the category of countries that drive on the right-hand side. That's what we'll do. This is the category of best practice, where it's clear that everyone says we see this happening and everyone agrees, and we can decide to do it that way. In complicated, I mentioned analysis. So we sense what's going on and we do some analysis. And this is where there's good practice. So experts may not agree. There's variation into what different providers, for instance, in healthcare might prescribe, but they all operate according to some general rules. And it's good practice. It's not best practice. So there's variability, and that is seen as allowable. So we don't over constrain the people with the expertise that really understand what could be going on, and we distinguish that as good practice. So in complex systems, what we want to do is we want to put out some probes. We want to try some things, see what happens. If we like what we see, we're going to amplify it. If we don't like what we see, we're going to dampen it. So with chaos, we have novel practice. The kinds of constraints, it's a new term that people may not be familiar with. People, I know the book Theory of Constraints talked about constraints. Constraints can contain, but they can also connect. So with the lower right-hand corner with obvious, these are fixed constraints, rigid constraints, and human beings are good at putting together constraints, to try to make our world more predictable. Governing constraints, rules about in what situations do you do certain things, but again, allowing for decision making by the experts. Enabling constraints, you think in terms of rules of thumb or heuristics about guiding heuristics that are going to guide the decision making. Whenever you have complex adaptive system, there's always going to be unintended consequences. So as you try to move forward, you're going to make run some experiments, you're going to try some things. And if you can keep those small experiments, the unintended consequences that will happen will be manageable. When people try to embark too quickly on something that they'd like to try, they have to know that they are responsible for those unintended consequences. And again, in the chaotic realm, there's really no effective constraints. It is purely random variation. When you enter accidentally, what you need to do is stabilize it. You can enter it deliberately, which can lead to innovation. And as I ponder about the situation we find ourselves with the coronavirus, I'm noticing that as people are trying to move forward, there's a lot of innovation. People are repurposing different things to serve the purpose of what they're trying to do. And this is one of the ways that you can introduce a chaotic situation. You can force it to happen if you want to build in some innovation. And that's what I notice is happening. But the problem is that when we don't understand these different domains, we are going to tend to act in our own comfort zone, the thing that's most familiar with us. And so that leads to this fifth domain, which is the disordered domain, where we don't know what we're doing. We don't know what sort of a situation we may find ourselves in. And if we haven't been exposed to this multi-ontology framework, a multi-way of the way the world is, and we don't realize the distinctions between these, we're likely to make matters worse. So the third rule is the framework serves to help with categorization, but more importantly, it can help you to understand, so what do we do? And the idea that we can move between the domains. And so in the complex domain, we have these different experiments, multiple parallel safe to fail experiments that we're going to on purpose try to see, let's see what happens, and think about what can we change. If I like what I see, I'm going to give it energy and attention. If I don't like this experiment, I'm going to shut it down and then try something else. So these are intended to be quick, parallel, multiple, safe to fail. And if done well, you would have some that you want to see fail, and you would also see some that have some knowledge. It's called, you want to have naive input, people that are unfamiliar with the subject matter but bring new knowledge into it. So there's a whole science behind how you would do this. I'm not going to get into this today, but anyway, the idea is as you can gain more confidence in what you're doing there, some of those can be stabilized and you can actually move them as you gain more confidence in the cause and effect relationship. You can move them over to the complicated amount. Be prepared that you might have to go back if the context changes and go back into some multiple experiments. And some can be moved from complicated down to the obvious. But you have to think about the few that you want to do this, not the many, and make sure that everyone's in agreement that that's the current best way we're going to do it. The way the Cynefin model is drawn, I'm going to just start to unpack that a little bit here, look at the different lines. The boundary on this side is less of a boundary and more of a continuum. You know, when is it complicated? When can we move it down to obvious? You know, where does things like standard work really fit into here? Probably on the right-hand side. How strongly it might go down to the obvious will remain to be seen. This barrier over here, and it's shown as a cliff, the distinction between the obvious and the chaotic is like a sheer cliff that drops down going from right to left. And so the reason that that distinction is there, and it's not just because those two are next to each other like a 2x2 matrix, there is a difference. And what happens when we overconstrain a system that cannot be constrained? We make rigid rules. We come up with things that are hampering people in what they need to do. People will come up with workarounds. People will figure out a way to survive and deal with the silly rules that are put together. And you find yourself in the complacency zone where the informal systems are making up for the deficit of the formal systems. And management may not see this because they think that their formal system, their constrained system is working. What they don't realize is the informal systems behind that people are using as coping mechanisms to survive. And then when something happens, you see this as a fall over into chaos. You're going to see that there's something drastic happens. I mentioned previously, it could be a wrong site surgery, it could be something like wrong medication, it could be the situation we find ourselves in. Again, I keep going back to the situation with the coronavirus, all the things that led to what happened that now causes us to be in this situation. And we could talk about how that might work and how that then what do we need to do to get out of this? Because it is a sheer cliff, it's very hard to climb up and try to get back into that obvious domain. And so we have to understand the differences. And if I plug the disordered domain back in here, we can then talk about an updated version of the Cynefin model that Dave has been introducing the last couple of years. And it's this liminal zone that talks about the transition between those domains. And liminality is an anthropology-based word that talks. You can think about it similarly as when people puts on clothing different than what they're wearing. Say an airline captain puts on their clothing, they're transitioning to another role, or putting on a mask, say for in theater, you're taking on the character of the mask. So as I was thinking about this and connecting it to the work of Dr. Deming, I thought about some of the work that he talked about, that he would say, you can know a lot about ice, but not know about water. And I thought about that, and I think that that might be a useful metaphor. When I think about the complex realm or domain, thinking about water as liquid, it's H2O. So you can think about it that way. When we can think about the transition into chaos, you know, heating up the water, it becomes vapor. It's still H2O, but you manage it differently. You think about it differently. And so there's a liminality aspect to the transition as you heat that water up, and how that is a phase shift, how it is different. And in the same terminology, make that water cold, remove the heat, and eventually you'll get ice. And so it's just my own metaphor to help me think about these things. But again, I think it might be beneficial to try to connect these things in that way to think about the differences. Some new terminology showing up. So I think that in future iterations, if I understand what Dave is talking about, obvious will be replaced with clear, which is nice because now you see um, C words all around in the corner, including in the disorder domain, which is confused. Now, there's another part of the disorder domain. So confused is when you don't understand the different ontologies, so you're different types of systems that are going on, and you're just merely operating based on doing your best. But there's another category, and he's calling this shorthand the AC domain. Aporia, it's like a figure of speech, as someone is pondering out loud with an audience, considering, shall I do this or shall I do that? And so it's a different sort of being disordered. You're trying to decide, so where am I at and what might I do? And so we'll look for different terminology coming up in the future. This bit.ly link will take you to Dave Snowden's blog post about this, and you can learn about that. So just to summarize the different moves or the dynamics, there are a few that you can take from complicated to obvious. This rotation or this moving between the complicated and the complex, thinking about exploring and exploiting what you did and trying to think about we're moving into stronger cause and effect understanding. Periodically going into chaos to disrupt, to break up the thinking, the untrained thinking that may be going on, and then continuously scanning, incubating, and exploring. This is going to be, it has become something that is more and more prevalent as conditions change, trying different things, seeing what's worked, moving them around, and understanding that that is the domain that you have. Now, I was thinking about this with the last webinar that Paul Deschamps did, and I don't see that he's on today's webinar, but he said it was okay for me to use this to connect with what he was talking about with his last webinar, which was physician burnout. And so the bit.ly link to the recording for his webinar is shown there. But when he was talking about burnout, he was talking about causes for burnout and what was going on, and thinking about the interaction between the worker and the workplace. And so you have highly motivated people that want to do well, but are hampered because of constant vigilance and focus. So think about that as far as perhaps over constraining, which then leads to a toxicity or a toxic environment. And then he unpacked this even more. And you can see I put the framework of the Cynefin model, people over constraining and then falling into chaos in the upper right hand corner, because I want to make connections between these two. And he recognized that there were many external drivers that influenced that workplace. Electronic health records, this whole idea of meaningful use from the government to prove that you're using the electronic health record, different coding that is required in healthcare in order to get reimbursement, all the different rules and constraints that the payers have, prior authorizations that are required, no shortage of acronyms and requirements for reporting agencies about metrics that need to be reported, customer feedback, patient feedback, whether it's in terms of HCAHPS or CCAHPS. You've got different patient demographics that people are dealing with. People come with what they've learned from Google and want to talk to the doctor about what they think should happen. The opioid crisis, overprescription of opioids, violence in the workplace, customers giving reviews, not just with formal surveys, but using Yelp. And then reducing reimbursement that goes on. And then what I liked what he did here, and again, it's got me pondering, here you have the coronavirus that comes in. And so in his presentation, he says, we've added the last straw and people are breaking. And I think that's, again, one of the things that I notice and think about with this. And how does that show up in what he talked about during his last webinar, the burnout from physicians, depression, substance abuse, actually physician suicide, how high it is compared to other professions. And again, I think this isn't just with the medical world. I think there's other professions where we experience and see burnout. The burnout process with various professions are probably informed by this model as well. So doctors and nurses feeling the need that they need to break the rules every day in order to provide the empathetic care. Jim Womack at a presentation years ago did a little play on the theme of the triple aim and called it triple M, more meaningless measures. I think which resonated with a lot of people. And Dave Snowden will often talk about in the United Kingdom, 20% of a hospital's budget is devoted to maintaining the measurement system. So how much of this is actually causing the problems that people have? So I'm going to pause again because I took some liberties with Dr. Duchamp's webinar, but also wanted to tie it back to what I'm noticing with the response to the coronavirus and see if it resonates with anybody on the webinar today. Does this make sense as a way to think about this?
Mike, I think this is Dan Robertson. I think your explanation of the Cynefin framework is probably the best I've heard, and tying it into essentially we're over constraining people. We're making a situation where people have to work around the process, and obviously that seems to be connected to burnout. So I think this resonates a lot, and I like the connection now to COVID-19. And is this the straw that breaks the camel's back, or how do we make sure we at least respond knowing how these things are connected? So thank you for sharing it.
Yeah, appreciate that. Appreciate your comments. Anyone else? Okay. Sounds like it's making sense. What I want to do is to make some connections back to our model and that we talk about when people confuse true north and this whole thing about measures. And so when most people that I know of that are talking about true north, whether it's healthcare or another organization, they're really talking about these measurable results, what they're trying to achieve. And it's a part of it, but it's not everything. And I like this quote: when a measure becomes a target, it ceases. First of all, it ceases to become a measure, and you actually destroy intrinsic motivation. Going back to Dr. Duchamp's webinar from last time, the motivated worker that really wants to do the best, you are actually destroying the intrinsic motivation. I think this is a powerful thing to think about and try to contemplate and try to minimize the impact of that. So rather than just settle with true north, we categorize it, we talk about it as true north, and realize that it is the connection between the overall purpose, how you view the organization, what you're trying to see, the behaviors that you exhibit every day, and the results that you get. And so we talk about a see, do, get relationship. Unpack that a little bit in an organization. This is for somebody that's making medical supplies. And so they have this goal, what they want to see. They're learning about behaviors driven by ideal behaviors. They're trying to exhibit those ideal behaviors, and different roles in the organization are going to exhibit those behaviors, different types of ideal behaviors. And what they get in terms of the KPI, there is a relationship. But one thing I want to be clear on is this is not a causal relationship. The behaviors do not cause the KPIs. They're more like leading indicators about when we see this today, what are we likely to get in the future relative to those lagging indicators. So I'm going to repeat that here with a little bit more wording that you can look at. But again, where we see where we're headed, how we see our purpose in the world, the assumptions about how things work, the behaviors we're going to exhibit those behaviors don't just come from an understanding of the principles. There's many factors that cause people to behave in a certain way. People are complex. People are not ants. That's why you can't use the simulation view of the model to try to explain human beings. Human beings are complex. Those behaviors and the attitudes can serve as a leading indicator that can connect to the outcomes. And in an earlier version of the sustainability model that we use, currently we have it down here on the lower right-hand corner. In a previous version, we placed it here to understand the importance of systems and that interaction between behaviors and outcomes. And this is where I would position the Cynefin sense-making framework, that when we understand those different domains and the types of actions that are needed that are going to work and not work, we're going to be a lot more successful in what we do. So some things to think about here. What seems to work in some settings, like factories, like machines, is not going to work in other settings. What works in a closed systems is not going to work in an open system or service organizations. And I've seen this a lot, whether it's healthcare or education. We try to lift what we learned, what another company did down the road relative to, call it lean or whatever, and they just are not going to work. They're not matched to that. And then when people try to transfer the language of methods and approaches, and again, many of these approaches match well within a current domain, but they could be mismatched if you're dealing with another domain. And when they try to lift those and then to apply it into systems like healthcare, education, government, again, open systems, social systems, human dynamics, it's not going to work. It's not going to be sustained. And so that's why I believe that a better understanding of the natural principles about how humans work, how systems work, is going to be a much better match for going forward. Now, this is a slide from some of our materials that we've used, and I've just redrawn this title as to say one way to look at a system is this way. So you might be familiar with the SIPOC framework, suppliers, inputs, process, output, customers. And it is one way to look at a system. You can look at the outputs and say, I can see those outputs, whether it's behaviors or performance. I can see this process, and I can see procedures within the process. And then I can think about all the inputs that come from that system. And I think that's true. But it has to be thought about in the context of what I showed with the Cynefin sense-making framework. Some systems have more structure than others. Some systems have a clearer goal and objectives, and some systems have stronger interconnectivity. So I think we're going to be careful about our language when we talk about systems as we move forward. Now, another way to look at systems, and this is the language coming from Dave and those at the Cynefin Center, the system is a network that's governed by constraints that create coherence. And an agent, and people will think about what is an agent. It's not just a person. It could be ideas. It could be group. It could be different things that are acting are those that are going to act within the system. So this slide and the next one serves sort of as a summary of some topics before I get on to closing this webinar down, just to serve as a summary. So again, some systems are ordered. They've got constrained behavior, get predictable and repeatable results. There are chaotic systems, random, unconstrained, difficult to create or sustain, and then complex systems. And so again, a repetition of some of the things from the Cynefin sense-making framework. This is a visual, again, going back to their website, that I like to show this distinction between that these are different system types and how different that they are. I'm going to show one more slide, and then I'm going to, because we're near the end of the hour, move to closing this down. I got a lot more slides that I want to share with you, but I'll do that at a future webinar. I want to just say one thing about the difference between drivers and modulators. So people talk about what's driving the behavior or what's driving the results. And that's language that comes from traditional systems thinking. And again, it's not wrong if you're in a certain world, but where you're not in the if you're dealing with complexity, it is not going to be useful. And we need to learn more about thinking about modulators. Now, one example that I like of this that Dave talks about is if you can imagine a flat surface like this, think about one of those air hockey tables that have the air coming out of it, and those that little disc is sliding around, and so there's a high coefficient of resistance, and you see these what are metal discs that are sliding around on this very slick surface. And so if I have magnets that are placed around this table, and some are of positive polarity and some are negative polarity, and some are of certain strength and some are of a lesser strength, some of which I control and some of which people I know control, and some of which are being controlled by other people, that's what complexity really looks like. So if I change the polarity of one of these electromagnets or change the strength, those disks are going to move around in a pattern. And if I do it again, they're going to do a similar pattern. So that's still pretty predictable. And I can say, well, it's driving that behavior. If I do it with two of those, change the polarity, change the strength, those disks are going to form a pattern. I can see those things behave in a certain way. But if I get into three, that is when I move into complexity. And on top of that, these disks start becoming magnetic, and they start to serve as magnets as well. And so we need to think about using terms like drivers carefully. And when we're dealing with complexity, we're not dealing with drivers, we're thinking about modulators. So what I'm going to do now is, and I know I put a lot of slides here that I was not going to use because I thought this might be at least a two-part webinar. I want to, again, do a highlight here and show that this is my resource for a lot of these materials, and I encourage people to learn about that. What happens next is this recording is going to be moved on our website to go to the previous event, so you can get the recording there. Also, anybody that participated will get a link to this. In April, Jason Schulist from the GLCI, the Generative Local Communities Initiative, has agreed to do a webinar for us, and I will reconnect with Jason to see if that's still on. I will also be prepared to go through the remainder of the slides that I didn't get to today if Jason isn't able to provide his webinar as he agreed or planned to do. Got a lot of topics in the works, and I guess I could add to this coping with COVID-19 and those aspects. I've been touching on it today, but would be happy to entertain any other topics people would like to talk about. Just so you know, we have a podcast now. Max Brown, one of the business partners, has put together a nice podcast. You can go directly and see those podcasts from our website or wherever you get your podcasts. It's called Purpose and Principles Podcast. He does a nice job there. And he too has also had some recent pondering and talking about coping with the COVID-19 situation. So improvement stories or lessons people would like to talk about and learn about, we'll schedule them for later this year. So a couple minutes left. If anybody has any final parting thoughts or feedback would be beneficial. Otherwise, I'll close the recording down. Anybody wants to stay on the line and just chat about life and how people are coping, I'd be happy to do that. Either way. So I'm going to pause and see if there's any comments or feedback.
Mike, this is Ken Eakin. Just I wanted to thank you for your presentation. It's a topic that's of great interest to me, and I think you did a really good job of explaining the Cynefin framework and how it relates to other things. I'd love to talk more. I know we're out of time now, but maybe at some other time we can chat. Sure. Because it's something that's pretty interesting to me. So thank you.
Appreciate that. And we can make some time. As I said, when I close this down, I'll stay on if anyone wants to chat or make any commitments for scheduling. We can do that. Okay, that's 1 hour and we're done. I hope everyone is doing their best, staying calm, washing their hands, social distance, and all that stuff. And happy to stay on if anyone would like to chat some more. So hope everyone has a good day and stay safe.